The following presentation will discuss the events of John Brown's raid as Harpers Ferry, as well as the aftermath of the event. We will look at the location, some background on John Brown, important figures, the Secret Six, Harpers Ferry, aftermath, and some interesting facts. Harpers Ferry is located in present-day West Virginia. At the time, it was just Virginia. The states would split into West Virginia and just Virginia in 1863, a few years after the events at Harpers Ferry. Harpers Ferry is located between the Shenandoah River and the Potomac River. You can see on the map the area where John Brown's raid occurs, as well as the bridges that go into the town. The two bridges would be important to the fall of Brown's raid. Before we talk about the actual events themselves, it is important to know who John Brown was. He was born into a strong anti-slavery family. He had lived a tough life, becoming bankrupt at the age of 42, and having more than 20 lawsuits against him. In 1837, he attended an abolition meeting in Cleveland, Ohio, changing his life forever. After this meeting, he would publicly announce his dedication to destroying the institution of slavery itself. His purpose was to disrupt the security of investing in slaves as property and to fulfill a pledge to God to increase hostility towards slavery. It is said that whenever a new face appeared in town, his first questions were always if they followed the Sabbath and opposed slavery. If so, they were fine by him. As early as 1848, Brown was planning an insurrection against the establishment of slavery. Soon, Brown would travel to Kansas with his 5 sons to fight against pro-slavery forces in Kansas. On May 25th, Brown and his sons at Pottawatomie Creek killed 5 men, triggering a summer of guerrilla warfare. This would later be known as Bleeding Kansas. Before we move on to Brown's plans back east, we should get to know some figures who will be involved in Brown's raid. Colonel Robert E. Lee, who would later be general of the Confederate Army during the American Civil War, would be sent into Harpers Ferry alongside Lieutenant Jeb Stuart. He would also become a general during the Civil War as well as a cavalry commander. They would be accompanied by 90 U.S. Marines. They would be sent from D.C. to fight against John Brown and his crew. Next, an important group of people to know are the Secret Six. This group of people would help fund the raid on Harpers Ferry. The group consisted of radical abolitionists who were wealthy and high-profile people in their respective towns. The members included Thomas Wentworth Higgins, from one of New England's oldest families, Garrett Smith, a very wealthy individual who was already Brown's benefactor, Reverend Theodore Parker, a minister, Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, a highly respected pioneer of education reforms for the blind, George Luther Stearns, a chief financier who had facilitated the settlement of Kansas to anti-slavery homesteaders, and Franklin Sanborn, a young schoolmaster. The main purpose of these 6 was to secure funds for Brown and his insurrection. Back east, after Bleeding Kansas, Brown would begin to raise money for an uprising of enslaved people. He had secured the backing of the Secret Six and collected enough for his raid. Soon his prophecy of destroying slavery was coming into reach. Leading up to the raid, Brown and his crew had stayed in the Kennedy farmhouse just outside of town, looking over and creating plans for their raid to kill time. Eventually the time had come, and the plan was put into motion. On October 16, 1859, John Brown and his crew would march into Harpers Ferry. The crew would take both bridges leading into town, as well as the U.S. Armory, Arsenal, and U.S. Rifle Works. Some local slave owners, Lewis Washington and John Alstad, were taken hostage and their slaves were freed. I have possession of the U.S. Armory, and if citizens interfere with me, I must only burn the town and have blood. John Brown was not there to be peaceful. We know he wanted to destroy slavery through force, and he wasn't going to let anybody stop him. On October 17th, a passenger train is stopped at the bridge that was taken by Brown and his crew. A train worker is shot and mortally wounded for investigating the train's delay. At about 6 a.m., Brown would capture and hold the workers who were coming into the armory who were reporting for work. Shortly after, the townspeople began firing on Brown and his crew. In the gunfire, a local grocery store worker is shot. Eventually, around 10 a.m., local militia units surround Brown and his crew, cutting off all escape routes, including the bridges. Raider William Thompson is captured under a white flag while asking for truce. At about midday, 2 more raiders, Watson Brown and Aaron Stevens, are shot under the second truce flag. Shortly after, another raider is shot trying to escape. At about 2 p.m., citizens eventually try and storm Brown's fort, being mostly unsuccessful except for freeing some hostages. The mayor ends up being shot for venturing too close without any form of protection. The mayor's death upsets a drunken mob who kills and throws William Thompson, the captured raider, into the Potomac River. On the morning of October 17th, 1859, an aide to Secretary of War John B. Floyd hurried off with an urgent message for Colonel Robert E. Lee. Floyd had just received word that the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, had been seized by a group of anti-slavery rebels led by the notorious John Brown. Floyd was ordering Lee to come to Washington. He was at leave on his home in Arlington, just across the Potomac. He was told to take command of a force being sent to Harpers Ferry to retake the arsenal and restore order to the community. Later that night, Colonel Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart would arrive by train from Washington, D.C. in Harpers Ferry alongside 90 Marines. On the morning of October 18th, Brown would refuse to surrender to Lieutenant Jeb Stuart. A Marine storming party breaks into the engine house. 1 Marine is killed and another is wounded. Brown is eventually captured alongside the remaining raiders. 16 people were killed in the raid, including 10 of Brown's men. Ultimately, Brown's actions were treason. Faced with charges of murder, conspiring with slaves to rebel, and treason against the state of Virginia, John Brown would go to trial on October 27th and last just 5 days. Jurors took only 45 minutes to reach a decision, guilty of all charges. On November 2nd, Brown was sentenced to hang on the gallows. All 6 of Brown's captured men were tried and hung. A contemporary newspaper account foretold the grim future. The Harpers Ferry invasion has advanced the cause of disunion more than any other event that has happened since the formation of the government. The hope of compromise between the North and South was slipping away. Before his execution, Brown would give his last words, an unfortunate omen as to what the future holds for the country. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. Here are some interesting facts that are related to John Brown and Harpers Ferry. While at the Kennedy farm, to keep up the appearance of a normal household, Brown sent his daughter, Annie, who was 15-years-old, and a raider's wife, Martha, who was 17 years old, to prepare meals, wash clothes, and keep nosy neighbors at a distance. This would help keep the face of the house unsuspicious to any passerbys. Another interesting thing is that in 2016, the United States Mint issued a quarter featuring Harpers Ferry as part of the America the Beautiful Quarters program. The Good Lord Bird is a TV series from the point of view of a freed slave nicknamed Onion who joins Brown on his crusade to end slavery. It includes characters like John Brown himself and others like Frederick Douglass. John Brown led a party of liberated slaves all the way from Missouri to Michigan. On December 1858, John Brown crossed the Kansas border and ordered slaves from the state of Missouri. Once there, he and his allies freed 11 state slaves and led them all the way to Detroit, Michigan, covering a distance of more than 1,000 miles, even while one woman gives birth. Brown's men had killed a slaveholder during the Missouri raid, so President James Buchanan put a $250 bounty on the famed abolitionist. That did not stop Brown or his men. They would make it all the way to the border of Canada and watch the freed people board a ferry and slip away. John Brown's Pennsylvania home was a stop on the Underground Railroad as well. Sometime around 1825, Brown moved himself and his family to Guy Mills, Pennsylvania, where he set up a tannery and built a house and barn with a hidden room that would be used by slaves on the run. Brown reportedly helped 2,500 slaves during his time in Pennsylvania. The building was destroyed in 1907, but the site, which is now a museum that is open to the public, is on the National Register of Historic Places. Brown moved his family back to Ohio in 1836. Citations include battlefields.org, Britannica.com, History.com, The Journal of American History, Volume 75 from JSTOR.org, The Quarterly Journal of the New York State Historical Association, Volume 5 from JSTOR.org, legendsofamerica.com, mentalfloss.com, the National Park Service.gov, pbs.org, show.com, sofrep.com, the USMint.gov, and the warfarehistorynetwork.com.